"You will go up," said the president of the missions, who resided at San Fernando. "First the Atabapo, then the Temi, and finally the Tuamini. When the force of the current of the black waters hinders you from advancing, you will be conducted out of the bed of the river through forest which you will find inundated. 2 monks only are settled in those desert places between the Orinoco and the Rio Negro. But at Yavita, you will be furnished with the means of having your canoe drawn over land in the course of 4 days to the Cano Pimichin. If not to be broken to pieces, you will descend the Rio Negro without any obstacle from northwest to southeast, as far as the little fort of San Carlos. You will go up to the Cassiquari from south to north, and then return to San Fernando in a month, descending the upper Orinoco from east to west." Such was the plan traced for their passage, and they carried it into effect without any danger, though not without some suffering, in the space of 33 days. In their walks together with the president of the mission gave the travelers an animated account of incursions on the Rio Guavara. He related to them how these journeys undertaken for the conquest of the souls were desired by the Indians of the missions. All, even women and old men, took part in them, under the pretext of recovering neophytes who had deserted the village. Children above 8 or 10 years of age were carried off and distributed among the Indians of the missions as serfs. 3 years before the arrival of the travelers, the missionary of San Fernando led his Indians to the banks of the Rio Guavare. On one of those hostile incursions, they found in an Indian hut a Guahiba woman with 3 children, 2 of them whom were still infants, occupied in preparing the flour of cassava. Resistance was impossible. The father was gone to fish, and the mother tried in vain to flee with her children. Scarcely had she reached the savannah when she was seized by the Indians of the mission. The mother and her children were bound and dragged to the banks of the river. The monk, seated in his boat, waited the issue of an expedition of which he shared not the danger. Had the mother made too violent a resistance, the Indians would have killed her, for everything was permitted for the sake of the conquest of the souls. And it was particularly desirable to capture children who might be treated in the mission as slaves of the Christian. The prisoners were carried to San Fernando in the hope that the mother would be unable to find her way back to her home by land, separated from her other children who had been accompanied by their father on the day in which she had been carried off. The unhappy woman showed signs of the deepest despair. She attempted to take back to her home the children who had been seized by the missionary, and she fled with them repeatedly from the village of San Fernando. But the Indians never failed to recapture her, and the missionary, after having caused her to be mercilessly beaten, took the cruel resolution of separating the mother from her 2 children who had been carried off with her. She was conveyed alone to the missions of the Rio Negro, going up the Atabapo. Slightly bound, she was seated at the bow of the ship, ignorant of the fate that awaited her. But she was judged by the direction of the sun that she was removing farther and farther from her hut and from her native country. She succeeded in breaking her bonds, threw herself into the water, and swam to the left bank of the Atabapo. The current carried her to a shelf of rock which bears her name to this day, the Mother's Rock. She landed and took shelter in the woods, but the president of the missions ordered the Indians to row to shore and follow the traces of Guahiba. In the evening she was brought back, stretched upon the rock, a cruel punishment was inflicted upon her with the straps of manatee leather, which served for whips in that country, and with which the accolades were already furnished. The unhappy woman, her hands tied behind her back, was then dragged to the mission of Yavita. She was there thrown into one of the Cassavarians. It was the rainy season, and the night was profoundly dark. Forests, till then believed to be impenetrable, separated the mission of Yavita from that of San Fernando, which was 25 leagues distant in a straight line. No other route was known then by that river. No man ever attempted to go by land from one village to another, but such difficulties could not determine a mother separated from her children. The Guahiba was carelessly guarded in the Casavari. Her arms being wounded, the Indians of Yavito had loosened her bonds. Unknown to the missionary and the accolades, having succeeded by the help of her teeth in breaking them entirely, she disappeared during the night, and at the sunrise she was seen at the mission of San Fernando, hovering around the hut where her children were confined. What that woman performed, added the missionary, who gave the traveler this sad narrative, the most robust Indian would not have ventured to undertake. She traversed the woods when the sky was constantly covered with clouds, and the sun during the whole days appeared but for a few minutes. Did the course of the river direct her way? The inundations of the rivers forced her to go far from the banks of the main stream, through the midst of the woods where the movement of the water had been almost imperceptible. How often must she have been stopped by the thorny lianas that formed a network around the trunks that they intertwined? How often must she have swum across the rivulets that ran into the Atapabo? This unfortunate woman was asked how she sustained herself through the 4 days. She said that, exhausted with fatigue, she could find no other nourishment than black ants. The travelers pressed the missionary to tell them whether the Guahiba had peacefully enjoyed the happiness of the remaining with their children, and if any repentance had followed this excess of cruelty. He would not satisfy their curiosity, but at their return from the Rio Negro, they learned that the Indian mother was again separated from her children and sent to one of the missions in the upper Orinoco. She there died, refusing all kinds of nourishment. Above the mouth of the Guasarcari, they entered the Rio Temi. The country exhibited the uniform aspect of forests, covering around perfectly flat. Wherever the river had formed caves, the forest was inundated to the extent of more than half a league square. To avoid the sinuosities of the river and shorten the passage, the navigation was performed here in an extraordinary manner. The Indians made the travelers leave the bed of the river, and then they proceeded southward across the river, across the forest, through open channels of 4 or 5 feet broad. The breadth of the water seldom exceeded half a fathom. These channels were formed in the inundated forest like the paths on dry ground. The Indians, in going from one mission to another, passed with their boats as much as possible by the same way, but the communications not being frequent, the forests of the vegetation sometimes produced unexpected obstacles. An Indian furnished with a machete, a great knife, a blade of which was 14 inches long, stood at the head of the boat, employed continually in chopping off the branches that crossed each other from the two sides of the channel. In the thickest part of the forest, they were astonished by an extraordinary noise. On beating the bushes, a shoal of freshwater dolphins, 4 feet long, surrounded their boat. These animals had concealed themselves beneath the branches of the bombax sevia. They fled across the forest, throwing out these spouts of compressed air and water, which had been given them in every language the name of blowers. How singular was this spectacle in an inland spot, 300 or 200 leagues from the mouths of the Orinoco and the Amazon. At 5 in the evening they regained with some difficulty the bed of the river. Their canoe remained fast for some time between the two trunks of the trees, and it was no sooner disengaged than they reached a spot where the several small channels crossed each other, so that the pilot was puzzled to distinguish the most open path. They navigated through a forest so thick that they could guide themselves neither by the sun nor the stars. On the 1st of May, the Indians chose to depart long before sunrise. The travelers were stirring before them, however, because Humboldt waited through vainly for a star ready to pass the meridian in those humid regions covered with forests. The nights became more obscure in proportion as they drew near to the Rio Negro and the interior of Brazil. They remained in the bed of the river until daybreak, being afraid of losing themselves among the trees. At sunrise, they again entered the inundated forest. To avoid the force of the currents on reaching the junction of the Temi with another little river, the Tuamini, the waters of which were equally black, they proceeded along the latter to the southwest. This direction led them near the mission of Yavita, which was founded on the banks of the Tuamini, and at this Christian settlement they were to find the aid necessary for transporting their canoe by land to the Rio Negro. They arrived at San Antonio de Yavita shortly before noon. They went every day to see how their canoe advanced on the portages. 23 Indians were employed in dragging it by land, placing branches of trees to serve as rollers. The canoe being very large, it was necessary to avoid with particular care any friction on the bottom. Consequently, the passage occupied more than 4 days. Hearing on the 5th that it had arrived, they set off and followed it on foot, fording a great number of streams, which were considered dangerous on account of the vipers which the marshes abounded. They passed the night in a hut lately abandoned by an Indian family who had left behind their fishing tackle, pottery nets made of the petioles of palm trees. In short, all that composed the household furniture of that careless race of men. Little attached to property. A great store of resin was accumulated around the house. This was used by the Indians to pitch their canoes and fix the bony spines of the ray, and at points of their arrows they found in the same place jars filled with a vegetable liquid, which served as a varnish, and was celebrated in the missions by the name of milk for painting. Before they took possession of the deserted hut, the Indians killed 2 manapare serpents. These serpents grew to 4 or 5 feet long. As the inside of the hut was filled with grass, and Humboldt and Bonpland were lying on the ground there with no means of suspending their hammocks, they were not without inquietude during the night. In the morning, a large viper was found on lifting the jaguar skin upon which one of their domestics had slept. They embarked on the Rio Negro on the 8th of May, passing the mission of Maroa and the mouths of the Aguio and the Tomo. They arrived at the little mission of San Miguel de Davipe, where they brought provisions, among which were some fowls and a pig. This purchase greatly interested their Indians, who had been a long time deprived of meat. They pressed the travelers to depart in order to reach the islands of Dapa, where the pig was to be killed and roasted during the night. They reached this island at sunset and were surprised to find some cultivated ground on it, and on top of a small hill, an Indian hut. 4 natives were seated around a fire of brushwood in this hut, and they were eating a sort of white paste with black spots. These black spots proved to be large ants. The hinder parts resembled a lump of grease. They had been dried and blackened by smoke. The travelers saw several bags of them suspended above the fire. These good people paid but little attention to their guests. Yet there were more than 14 persons in the confined hut, lying naked in hammocks, hung one above another. When Father Zia arrived, he was received with great demonstrations of joy. 2 young women came down from their hammocks to prepare for them cakes of cassava. In answer to some inquiries which were put to them through an interpreter, they answered that cassava grew poorly on the island, but that it was a good land for ants and food was not wanting. In fact, these ants were furnished substance to the Indians of the Rio Negro and the Guanina. They did not eat the ants as a luxury, but because the fat of the ants was a very substantial food. When the cakes of cassava were prepared, Father Zia, whose fever seemed rather to sharpen than to enfeeble his appetite, ordered a little bag to be brought to him filled with smoked ants. He mixed these bruised insects with flour of cassava, which he pressed in Humboldt and Bonpland to taste. It somewhat resembled rancid butter mixed with a crumb of bread. The cassava had not an acid taste, but some remains of the European prejudices prevented their joining in the praises bestowed by the good missionary on what he called an excellent ant paste. The violence of the rain obliged them to sleep in this crowded hut. The Indians slept only from 8 till 2 in the morning. The rest of the time they employed in conversing in their hammocks and preparing their bitter beverage of quapana. They threw fresh fuel on the fire and complained of cold, although the temperature of the air was 70 degrees. This custom of being awake and even on foot 4 or 5 hours before sunrise was general among the Indians of Guanana. The travelers left the island of Dapa long before the daybreak, and notwithstanding the rapidity of the current and the activity of their rowers, their passage to the fort of San Carlos del Rio Negro occupied 12 hours. They were informed at San Carlos that on account of political circumstances, it was difficult at the moment to pass from the Spanish to the Portuguese settlements. But they did not know till after their return to Europe the extent of the danger to which they would have been exposed in proceeding as well far as Barcelos. It was known at Brazil that through the medium of the newspapers that Humboldt was going to visit the missions of the Rio Negro and to examine the natural canal which unites two great systems of rivers. In those desert forests, instruments had been only in the hands of commissioners of the boundaries, and at that time, subaltern agents of the Portuguese government could not conceive how a man of sense could expose himself to the fatigues of a long journey to measure lands that did not belong to him. Orders had been issued to seize his person, his instruments, and above all, his registers of astronomical observations. The pair of dangerous naturalists were to be conducted by way of the Amazon to Grand Para, and thence back to Lisbon. But fortunately for Humboldt, the government of Lisbon, on being informed of the zeal of its ignorant agents, instantly gave orders that he should not be disturbed in his operations, but that on the contrary they should be encouraged if he traversed any part of the Portuguese possessions. On the 10th of May, their canoe being ready, they embarked to go up to the Rio Negro as far as the mouth of the Casaguare, and to denote themselves to researches of the real course of that river, which united the Orinoco to the Amazon. The morning was fine, but in proportion as the heat augmented, the sky became obscured. The heat was so saturated by vapors in these by water in these forests that the vesicular vapors became visible in the least incurable increase of evaporation on the surface of the earth. The breeze being never felt, the humid strata were not displaced and renewed by drier air. The travelers were every day more agreed by the aspect of the cloudy skies. Bonpland was losing by this excess humidity the plants he had collected, and Humboldt for his part was not afraid lest he should again find the fogs of the Rio Negro in the valley of the Casaguare. No one in these missions for half a century past had doubted the existence of communication between two great systems of rivers. The important point of their voyage was confined, therefore, to fixing by astronomical observations the course of the Casaguare, and particularly the point of which its entrance into the Rio Negro and that of the bifurcation of the Orinoco. Without to sight of the sun and the stars, that this object would be frustrated, and they would have exposed themselves in vain to long and painful privations. Their fellow travelers would have returned by the shortest way, that of the Pimichin and the small rivers, but Bonpland and Humboldt persisted in the plan of the voyage, which they had traced for themselves by passing the great cataracts. They had already traveled 180 leagues in a boat from San Fernando de Apure to San Carlos, on the Rio Apure, the Orinoco, the Atabapo, the Temi, the Tuamini, and the Rio Negro, and again entering the Orinoco by the Casaguare. They would have to navigate 320 leagues from San Carlos to Angostura. By this way, they would have to struggle against the currents during 10 days. The rest was to be performed by going down the stream of the Orinoco. It would have been blamable, they thought, to have suffered themselves to be discouraged by the fear of a cloudy sky and by the mosquitoes of the Casaguare. Their Indian pilots promised them the sun and those great stars that eat the clouds as soon as they should have left the black waters of the Guavare. They therefore carried out this first project of returning to San Fernando de Atabapo. by the Cassiquare, and by fortunately for their researches, the prediction of the Indian was verified. The white waters brought them by degrees a more serene sky, stars, mosquitoes, and crocodiles.